introduce that concept, but essentially we're looking at these 4 women from Matthew's genealogy, partly because the church has done them poorly by sometimes calling them bad women, mostly because they have a different sexual ethics than we would like, largely because they were in positions where they had no other choice. And yet we get to stand in our ivory towers and condemn them. And so I think we talked about how Matthew weaves them into the genealogy where they don't belong because they wove themselves into stories they were trying to be written out of. Probably Rahab's the best example because there is absolutely no way Rahab is in Jesus' genealogy. If you were to try to, we talked about these weren't historical documents. If you look at it, they have Rahab marrying the Boaz, who is like a generation before Ruth. That's about 200 years off in historical genealogy. But we pointed out this isn't a historical genealogy, it's a theological genealogy. So what does Rahab have to teach us? And I've given you, as I will, all 4 weeks, the text of the story, but I'm going to narrate the story myself, which means look out, Andrew's interpreting, already, before he interprets his interpretation of an interpretation, right? So listen now to this story. I have to give you, my friends, an intro into this story. You see, this isn't a story we can tell lightly anymore. We who hear echoing the thunder of bombs in Gaza have to tread lightly on conquest stories. And so whenever we open up to the book of Joshua, we recognize that we're walking into complicated history. Right? History we have abused to our own benefit as conquerors. Right? And so we walk into this story full of nationalities, and yet perhaps we are invited as we slide in to see in this story what could be if nationality wasn't our common belonging. What would it mean for us to set that aside as Rahab did? Who is Rahab, you ask? We're getting there. First, you remember that when God heard the cries of God's people in Egypt, God got Moses, that Egyptian Jewish guy who fled to the land of Midian after killing an Egypt overlord on behalf of his people that weren't his people. God found that one guy out in the wilderness and said, "It is good that you of all people go and free my people. You who are of both those people." And Moses went and they got freed. They go across the Red Sea. I'm skirting probably the most important story in Jewish history, but I got to get going. So they get to the Promised Land quickly in the book of Numbers, which nobody has ever read from cover to cover. But the spies sent into the Promised Land come back, and what do they say to the Jewish people? We can't do it. What? There are giants there. What was God thinking? And God's not super keen on people questioning God's faithfulness in that way. The only 2 who didn't question were Joshua and Caleb, the 2 faithful spies. But the rest did, and so God says, go wander for 40 years, let this faithless generation pass away, and then we'll get you back to the Promised Land. So we are back in Joshua 1 where we were in Numbers 11. And now Joshua, taking a page out of Moses' book, has sent spies into the land to figure out what's going on amongst the Canaanites. Because we have to walk gently into this conquest story. It's Canaanite land already. And among other things, there's a giant walled city called Jericho that's doing really well by it and doesn't particularly wish to be dispossessed of its land. So the spies get in and they get in the city, but they quickly get found out. So they have to hide from the king, and they end up hiding with Rahab. Now Rahab is a prostitute. There's no way to sugarcoat it. There's no way to tell it otherwise. Rahab is a prostitute, and she makes a living doing things we're not going to talk about. But I think there's something in this story that we often miss. You see, in a moment, Rahab is going to immediately say, if you're going to save my life, you can't just save my life. You have to save my father's life, my mother's life, my sister, my brother, my family's life. This is probably a bigger hint to Rahab's situation than we realize. You see, it's likely Rahab didn't choose prostitution because it was a life choice, but that her family has become indebted servants. Her family has accrued debt it cannot pay off, and there lacks a son to take the role of her father to help pay it off. And Rahab has been the one who's taken on the responsibility to provide for her family. But the system doesn't have a way for her to do that. So long before we get to Rahab's story, she's already a wayfinder. She is already one who put her own reputation aside to find a way for her family. And when the spies are running around trying to get away from the king's guard, she brings them in without hesitation to her house, which is probably her family's house. And because Rahab is not a good lawyer, she saves them before she gets them to sign any contract to do likewise to her. She just saves them. She puts them up on the roof. And the king's guards knock on the door. Open up! We saw them go in there. And with a grace I can't imagine, she opens the door and says, "You're right. They were here. But they jumped out the window and they're gone, and I don't know where they went. I think they fled the city and they're down by the river." And all the guards jump out the window and go find them there because she's so convincing. Then she climbs out the window, but up onto the roof, and it says that up on the roof there is drying bundles of flax. Now this seems like a trivial matter to the story, but flax is bundled and dried right before the barley harvest. And the barley harvest is an identifier for us in our ancient stories as the time of the Passover. Which is to say, Ruth's story is a decidedly Jewish story for a Canaanite prostitute. So she goes up there to the flax, and she pulls them up out where she's buried them in this drying flax on her roof. And now it occurs to her that she should have gotten a contract. So she says, they're looking in the wrong place. I know, I have heard by heaven, your God dried up the Red Sea so you can walk across it. And by earth, I know that you already defeated the kings of Og and Shegog, or something else, Og. And so I know that your God is real and powerful, and I want your God to protect my family. Not me, my father, my mother, my brother, my sister, my aunts, my nieces, my nephew. I'm figuring she's a good backwoods Tennessee, so half the state is related to her. And when they finally pull her out in the conquest, they go, "Wait a second, we said a family. Who are all these people?" "They are all my family, and I have saved them all." But we get ahead of ourselves. They tell her, "Put this red cord over your window during the invasion, and that will save you. Does this put something in your mind, oh friends of mine, of another story we've told here? When the Israelites, for the 10th plague, put the blood of the Paschal lamb over their doorposts so that God's angel of death passed over their household. A story we recite on Jesus' own death and resurrection. Rahab, too, put the blood of a lamb above her doorpost to be saved because she stood up and saved them. So when the time came for that invasion to happen, they stormed. The chaos, the walls fell, trumpets blasting, but they saved all of Rahab's family. And in the time to come, Matthew would say, this made her a champion of justice in the line of Jesus. And James would say she reckoned her self-righteousness by her works. And Hebrews would say she demonstrated what it was to be a person of great faith. That means the works righteousness people and the justification by faith people are all united. Rahab is a good one. This is the word of the Lord. I find this story fascinating. These should be fascinating. Whenever we're reading the biblical text, the things that look like they don't belong are the things we ought to pay the most attention to. And Rahab does not belong. She's not Jewish. She's not someone you're supposed to want to bring home to your dad. She's not a particularly educated or elite person. She probably isn't actually in any way, shape, or form an ancestor of Jesus. So why, oh Matthew, why do you put her into the story? And I think, the Jews knew what it was like to be written out of people's stories. We had an opportunity recently. I was at the Dallas Holocaust Museum. Holocaust museums dot the landscapes of our life. And I came across a list of how many Jews were killed in each country. I am proudful of being the son of Polish immigrants. 3.5 million. By far the largest Jewish population was killed in Poland, where almost all of the death camps resided. It reminded me as I stared about this place, about a country from which I get so much pride, to feel so much shame. It reminded me of another Holocaust museum that I visited years ago in Washington, D.C., and they were doing a temporary exhibit called "And Some Were Neighbors." And the museum went through the stories of Jewish children whose dearest friends' families betrayed them to Germany. And it went through other stories, places like La Chambon, which we used to give my head of staff a lot of flack for because he would tell this story all the time. Accounted for in the book Lest Innocent Blood Be Shed. An entire village of France who put their lives on the line like Rahab to become a sheltering place for Jews. Jews they didn't even know. They were all neighbors, but they all chose to be very different neighbors. I think the conquest narratives, Joshua's entire text from beginning to end, is a text in which we have to be incredibly confessional about. But not as those who say, look about the problems we did then, but as the people who still walk upon the land of the Paiute Bannock people, the Shoshone people. We have problems creating a sense of place and belonging by othering other people, right? By creating our own sense of pride. When I did the the walk through the Washington, D.C. Holocaust Museum, we had gotten a backstage tour from a Bonhoeffer scholar. She had done her PhD work on Bonhoeffer, and she recounted that in the early 30s, the church in the United States wrote to the church, the evangelical church in Germany, and said, "We do not like the rhetoric that is coming out of Germany right now, this language of Hitler, this language that sounds very othering." And the church wrote back, "Oh no, this is exactly what Germany needs right now. This is what will restore us to have pride in ourselves again." That wasn't a German problem. It's a Jewish problem, a Canaanite problem, a German problem, a Roman problem, a Babylonian problem, an American problem. In a country where Christian nationalism is on the rise. And so I wonder at this thread, I tease at this thread of the Rahab story that says, here is a person who put nationality aside. It's possible that when they wrote the Joshua text, when they recorded these sacred stories, they were very intentional about trying to create a connection between Rahab's family as indentured servants to an oppressive system and the poor people of Israel who had left Egypt from just that situation. Rahab stood on the side of the oppressed. Does that sound like someone else you know? Whether Rahab is the great-grandmother of Jesus or not, I imagine Mary, who like Rahab said, "Let it be with me according to your word." That Rahab would tell Jesus, little kid Jesus, "Have you ever heard the story of Rahab?" I mean Mary. Mary. It helps me if I get my names right. Mary would tell her son Jesus, "Have I told you the story about Rahab?" Not a Jewish hero, not a Canaanite hero, a hero of the people who put her own life on the line to save as many people as she could. Be Rahab, Jesus. And he was. And we commit now to be like Jesus. To come here weekly, to listen to these sacred stories, to figure out how we can walk in his way. So we put a pin in the story of Rahab, a Canaanite prostitute, eking it out to save her family any means she can find. And we pull that string, and we wrap it around Jesus, and we pull that string, and we get it to us today. Where are you going to wrestle the world into being a more just and loving place? Not to save your life, but to save the life